A thump made Cecilia jump. She opened her eyes, focusing on the dimming embers of the fire, and swallowed before looking in the direction of the door, then back to the fire as the school clock resonated 3. Where was she? Cecilia thought to herself, and she glanced at her research book, which had fallen to the floor and awoken her. With a sigh, Cecilia got to her feet and, picking up the research book, and made her way steadily towards the back of classroom. 3 o'clock. That meant Snape would soon be here. Now, where was she? She surveyed the potions again as the cogs in her mind began to creak into action. Matches. Yes, the potion that Snape had adjusted, a 3-to-1 blend and another 1-to-1. Lacing. She looked down at the potions codex, and wolfsbane, a herb which historically was burned to ward off werewolves, has in recent years been developed into a drug to prevent the werewolf in their human form from losing their mind upon transformation. Cecilia read the passage again, shaking her head. Werewolves? Hadn't Snape told her they didn't exist? However much of the book seemed to be based on fable and legend, she reminded herself, and probably wasn't all that useful. Picking up the nearest cauldron, she decanted a small portion into a flask, stirring it before setting it down and proceeding to the large cauldron that Dobby had filled with water that evening for her to start it warming in the fireplace. Now, once I get the 1-to-1 potion done, we'll have more of an idea about Dash. A crash broke Cecilia's thoughts, and she hurried towards the door of the classroom, opening it and looking out. Before her a figure lurched down the corridor, limping and staggering. It was Snape. Once Cecilia realized this, she went after him. His gait was awkward, but he was still moving at a fair rate. "Severus?" she called, hoping that he'd slow. Instead he waved his arm, clearly not wanting her there, but Cecilia chased after him determinedly, following him into the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom. In the darkness she saw him sag to his knees, sighing with exhaustion and looking at the floor, and she hurried in his direction. "Severus," she spoke, almost under her breath. His breathing was labored and he gasped when she said his name. "Oh no," thought Cecilia as she moved towards him slowly, looking in shock at the injured figure of Severus Snape. Had he been coming back from Death Eater meetings like this every night? How often had this been happening? Tentatively she approached the injured Snape, like an injured animal that might lash out. Carefully she dropped to her knees beside him, falling to his level. Slowly she raised her hand and put it on his shoulder. At her touch he flinched, but made no effort to repel her. At length he turned his head, becurtained with mud-caked hair which, Cecilia noticed, matched his damaged and filthy clothes, and her eyes met with his. "I will mend," he said, willing her not to say anything. "The disadvantage of being a double agent," he explained. Absently, Cecilia traced her hand down his left arm, pulling away sharply when she noticed his eyes narrow. "The Dark Lord was particularly displeased with me this night. However, as I still have my life, I must assume I am still of some use to him." Cecilia felt her mouth open in horror, and further still as Snape became more erect, leaning back on his ankles. A huge wound was gashed across his chest where his robe was ragged. "Madame Pomfrey," said Cecilia slowly. "I'll get her. We can tell her I foolishly let out a Thestral from the stables and it attacked you." As she was beginning to rise to her feet, Snape turned in her direction again and took her by the wrist, pulling her back down. "No." The word was firm and the intonation immovable. Cecilia felt the urge to argue but fought it. "Then I'll treat you." He looked at her in amazement, but said nothing. "Can you stand? You'll have to perform the spells, and if you tell me the ingredients I'll prepare them." She waited for Snape to respond. Eventually he nodded and clambered to his feet, and Cecilia tried not to gasp aloud at what she saw. His right arm looked almost dislocated as he held it away from his torso, and his chest injury that had seeping blood onto his clothing moments ago began to drip onto the floor. His thigh seemed to be slashed near the front and he was standing awkwardly on both feet as if his ankles had also sustained injury. "Yes," he said, looking through his hair at Cecilia again, which, as she looked harder now, was not coated in just mud but in dried blood clumping it together. From his robe he slipped his wand and he pointed it towards a table in the corner of the classroom. "Axio Murtlap," he breathed, "Axio Pestle and Mortar. Axio Cauldron." The items he was calling for shot in through the defense classroom door and landed on the table. Cecilia looked at them and back at Snape, knowing that an essence of Murtlap would merely soothe his injuries, rather than promote healing. Cecilia proceeded towards the items in the dimly lit classroom, wishing that she had the nerve to ask for permission to light the lamps, and she felt his hand on her right forearm. She turned and realized he was on his knees again. "Let me help you," she said softly. Without looking at her, he nodded, loosening his grip and allowing his injured right arm to fall to his side. Quickly Cecilia made her way to the table and returned with the ingredients and equipment, and she began to pull the Murtlap weed into smaller pieces before dropping it into the mortar, and feelings of care and concern began to replace the shock and distress. As she worked the plant with the pestle, Snape watched her carefully, pounding at it until it became a liquefied mush. Lifting it carefully, she took the small cauldron, which contained just about the right amount of water Cecilia noticed, and began to pour the Murtlap into it. "No." Snape's word made her stay her hand in the process of making the solution. She looked at him in confusion, but did not argue, laying down the mortar and pestle. "I do not deserve this." Snape looked at Cecilia carefully, his eyes firmly fixed on her. "You have chosen to do this." But, Snape stopped, panting to regain his breath. "There is something you need to know. Tend me if you will thereafter if you believe I warrant your compassion. Cecilia." He coughed and looked down. "Once you have heard it, decide." Cecilia waited for him to continue, ignoring the nagging pain in her knees as she knelt before him. She reached forward to take his hand, but he pushed her away. "I was in the employ of the Dark Lord during the last war." Snape spoke slowly, his words falling like ton blocks of granite into Cecilia's ears. "I knew that Pettigrew had broken the secret to Voldemort of the Potter's whereabouts. I had the opportunity to stop the 2 Death Eaters sent as scouts from finding them. I had the means to prevent the Dark Lord from killing the Potters. I did neither." Suddenly, Snape stopped. He continued to stare at the floor, and the chasm between them was filled with a vacuum. Neither of them spoke for a very long time. Then Cecilia looked down and picked up the mortar. She poured the Murtlap liquid into the cauldron, taking the rim and swirling it in circles. Then she got to her feet, taking the packet of matches she had in her pocket and striking the phosphorus tip against the rough surface of the fireplace. Once she hung the small cauldron above the fire to reduce, she crossed back over to Snape. He was still on his knees, and Cecilia had a feeling that some of his blood was seeping onto the flagstones. And then Cecilia Frobisher knelt before Snape again, about to touch him on the shoulder. He followed her gesture and she stopped, becoming the first person to understand Severus Snape. With her left hand she reached up towards his face, pushing aside his hair. He regretted his actions. To such an extent he punished himself. Was punishing himself. To fill the lack of retribution he'd received when working with Dumbledore. Snape's whole life had been punishment, even for things he had not done. He did not know how to accept forgiveness. Cecilia placed her lips lightly on his forehead before withdrawing and making her way over to the simmering essence. She had to find a way to get the potion that would remove Voldemort right. Not just for Harry. She also had to do it for every wizard and muggle who had been and was being affected by Voldemort's single-minded pursuit of power. She had to do it for Snape. 88,888,888. On the Saturday afternoon following Harry's non-attendance of her lessons, the Mole Studies classroom door opened and Harry entered, closely followed by Snape and Dumbledore, whose presence was clearly to demonstrate unity amongst adults. Grumpily Harry apologized for not having attended before and asked her where he should begin. Then he spent a good 2 hours on a bright winter afternoon in helping her. As they worked, Cecilia reflected that Harry had said nothing about the events at Christmas. He had also said very little about anything else, although Cecilia put this down to a mixture of nerves and unease, and didn't press him. What she did do, however, was discuss science with him, and even though Harry didn't seem particularly happy about it, he did engage in 1 or 2 comments about what Cecilia was informing him, but the whole experience was, she noted disappointedly, quite unlike their working relationship before Christmas. And once the 2 hours was up, he'd left hastily and as sullenly as he'd arrived. Outside the door Ron stood, leaning against the wall with one foot against it, arms folded. As Harry shot through the door, he jumped forward. "Harry," he exclaimed, chasing after Harry and to catch up with him. "How'd it go?" "Same as ever," said Harry, dully. "That's a relief," said Ron as they made their way back towards the Gryffindor common room. "A relief?" "It was awful." Harry huffed as they made their way outside and crossed the courtyard to the main doors of the castle. "But I thought you said dash." "It was terrible. I mean, they're always awful." "What happened?" Ron whispered as they passed a couple of Ravenclaw third years on the stairs. "We did science. She talked about Paracelsus." "Our Paracelsus?" "Apparently he was a mole who spoke about poisons and doses. I don't see how that could be anything but awful." They made their way towards the Fat Lady portrait, their conversation lagging to nothing as they passed a few Gryffindors coming through the hole behind the portrait. One of them held aside the picture frame and Ron and Harry stepped through, ignoring the demands from the Fat Lady that they speak the password. "Thanks," said Ron to the first year that was holding the frame. "It was worse," muttered Harry as they made their way across the empty common room. "She's changed. More distant. Less lenient on you," said Ron accusingly. "Less sympathetic. She's making you work, more like it. I did tell you to go, and it would be over. Now Dumbledore and Snape are taking you. You've not got much choice." They proceeded up the stairs towards the dormitories. Changing the subject, "I saw Angelina when I was waiting for you," said Ron, pushing open the boys' dormitory door. "Said we've got an extra hour Quidditch practice tonight, to make up for us all being busy and missing odd practices." Harry nodded, throwing himself onto his bed and leaning over and pulling out his Quidditch strip from underneath. "We're to meet her in the common room at 6, I think she wants to speak to us all." "Good. I'll enjoy that after all that science." "Science?" Behind them, Neville Longbottom crossed the floorboards of the dormitory, grinning at Ron. "Don't you like science, Harry? I think her lessons are fine." "Yes, Neville, because she's been teaching about ecology, geology, plants and rocks." "Herbology, really?" Harry retrieved his shirt and robe, looking crestfallen at its condition. "Forgot the wash, eh?" said Neville, conversationally. "Yes, but they'll have to do. Got a marathon of a practice, haven't we?" Ron nodded in agreement and they got to their feet. "See you, then," said Neville. "I'm going to the greenhouses, got some Mimbellus to take care of that Professor Sprout has managed to breed from my original." "What do you think, Ron? Still find her appealing after what she did to Remus?" Harry threw his kit under his arm and watched as Ron did the same, noting that Ron had forgotten wash day too. "I mean, she struts around here." They made their way back down the stairs and into the common room. Full of it. There were a few members of the Quidditch team milling around now. "SHSHSH," hissed Ron as they stepped across the floor. One or two of the team noticed them and waved. Ron waved back. "I don't care if people hear," said Harry defiantly. "She deserves it." "Does she?" whispered Ron urgently as Angelina Johnson approached them with what looked like a list of key points she wanted to address before they got onto the pitch. "She deserves grief from Malfoy, does she?" "Thanks," he added to their Quidditch captain, as he took a piece of parchment from her hands. "She's not getting any," whispered back Harry. "But that's not to say they won't. If Malfoy's keen on winning favor back with his father and the Death Eaters, then there's no telling what he might do." "Good evening," boomed Angelina, who was standing on an armchair as a platform so the Gryffindor Quidditch team could see her. "Thank you for coming. Now I know we have, for one reason or another, not had a full team. McGonagall's been setting some pretty gross essays. "Hear, hear," agreed someone near the front. "Horrific," shouted Fred Weasley, nodding at his brother. "Well, grief from me," whispered Harry. Ron took his eyes off Angelina and stared at him, frowning in incomprehension. "If she still intends on getting a sample of Mum to use for her weird science, then I'm going to stop her. Got to keep the A tight midfield to drive the opposition back to their hoops." Angelina was looking at the Quidditch team and reserves as she spoke, addressing each position as she went through her list. "Who told you she was going to do that?" Ron stopped, rolling his eyes. "Sirius." Harry said nothing. "The snitch, Harry." Both Ron and Harry broke their stare and looked at Angelina. "If we're down points, you need to make sure you prevent the opposition from getting it without catching it yourself." Harry nodded lamely, trying to look as if he was taking in what his captain was telling him as a feeling of self-defense began to grow in his stomach. Why shouldn't he believe Sirius? He'd never had any reason to distrust him. "Well, that explains why you completely ignored her during this morning's lesson. And I suppose you speak to him over the when we're all in bed?" Ron nodded towards the fireplace, grumpily. Even though Harry had agreed that Ron could go with him, he had still woken on several evenings to find Harry's bed empty and his invisibility cloak gone. "What else has he been telling you?" "That they were close at the ball, she and Snape," said Harry, hissing sharply, "and that he'd been telling her things about my family." Listening at the back, Ron looked up at Angelina, who nodded at their transgression and frowned. "So we really must ensure that our moves are tighter, crisper, and more adept. None of this raggedy syncopation. Synchronization, that's the key." "You really are up yourself, Harry," Ron continued, glancing every so often in the direction of Johnson. "She's here doing what she can, to stop Voldemort in the only way she knows how? And with Dumbledore's approval." He stopped as the gathered Quidditch team began to move in the direction of the door. "And what do you know about it?" said Harry, darkly as they headed towards the back of the fat lady's portrait. "You act like she has come here just to make your life difficult," insisted Ron in a whisper, holding the frame for Harry, as the first year had done for them on their way in. "Hasn't she?" Harry glared at Ron. "Now, before we get onto the Quidditch pitch, I will warn you that I will be making notes about outperformance tonight." Angelina Johnson stopped in front of the huge entrance doors, turning to address the team again. "And you think talking to Sirius is going to help?" "I've got to talk to someone, Ron." Harry shook his head as they proceeded down the steps to the entrance hall before the Great Hall. "Our spying on her every move isn't going to change anything. Not the fact she is here. Constructive criticism, that's all," added Angelina, waiting for the doors to open themselves. "And not the fact that that potion's going to ruin my life." 88,888,888. The fifth-year Mole Studies class was going relatively well, considering it was the last lesson on Wednesday. Cecilia had retired to the back of the classroom, watching Susan Bones present her information about the geography of Britain. Susan had chosen to discuss the choice of concrete as a building material in the 1960s, which turned out to be a surprisingly interesting topic in the end. At least the last few fifth-year lessons had not been too taxing for her. It had taken almost a week for each student to present their work. And now, as Susan took a bow, having answered an array of questions about the use of limestone in the process, and its impact on the landscape through mining by mills, a grey cloud of worry descended over Cecilia. All of the students present had presented their work now, and as some of them were missing that lesson, a surprising number as a regular occurrence on a Wednesday afternoon. And now, with half of the lesson remaining and no backup work, it was up to her to provide some work. Excellent, excellent. Cecilia congratulated Susan as she returned to her seat, and to you, Mr. Finch-Fletchley, and Mr. Weasley also. She looked at the students in the class again as she passed them and made her way back to the front. At least by assessing their communication skills she wasn't ignoring basic grammar and literacy. Harris, her old mentor, would have been proud at her cross-curricular emphasis. Overall, an excellent set of presentations which, by my reckoning, has left us with, the school clock told 4 sonorations, half an hour left of the lesson. Now, Cecilia surveyed the glum faces staring back at her and sighed inwardly, hoping this would enliven them. We are due to start Mull history again, the 20th century next week, which links neatly into the work you covered in the history of magic at the end of last term. While I wait for Professor Binns to enlighten me of the exact content, I'll give you a choice as to what you would like to do with the rest of this lesson. The students did not so much stir at her words. Many of them remained glum-faced. Parvati and Padma Patil were examining each other's fingernails. Ron was fiddling with the cuff of his sleeve. Harry wasn't even looking at her. He was looking at the floor, idly playing with his wand. Only Hermione seemed the slightest bit interested, and even she had her head rested in the V-shape of her hands. So, we can either play some Mull board games and puzzles from the cupboard. There were a few nods at this suggestion, or dash. Cecilia stopped as the class began to stir. A few of them began to chat under their breaths, and she waited until the noise had dropped lower. "Or?" shouted out Hermione, her hand raised. Cecilia looked at her and nodded. Okay, she said, calling their attention. Yes, there is an or, she acknowledged Hermione. Or, I could discuss some cutting-edge work that has been undertaken very recently regarding energy in science and magic. All at once the noise stopped dead, as if the particles had been sucked out of the room, and Cecilia was standing now before her class in a vacuum. One or two of them had stopped mid-action. Padma Patil was looking up from her azure nails, her hands stuck out before her from where she had been admiring them a few seconds ago. Hermione and Ron looked at her knowingly, and Hermione was smiling. Long had the young witch been seeking the details of her research. And Harry had frozen in mid-roll of his wand in his palm, his thumb preventing it from falling to the floor, and he was staring firmly at the grey flagstones. Cecilia could see what part of the side of his face that was not obscured by long hair grow pale, as did the outline of his ear. "Energy in science and magic?" asked Ernie Macmillan, his voice cutting through the heavy silence like a hot knife through butter. "Can you explain, Mrs. Frobisher?" Cecilia nodded. "Before I do, and with 25 minutes of the lesson to go, it would not be fair if I didn't get you to vote on what you'd like to do. So," she asked brightly, acutely aware that Harry had moved from his disinterested position and was now staring at her icily. "Mull games." A few people raised their hands tentatively, looking at one another uncertainly. "Or energy." Far more put up their hands now: Ron, Justin, Padma. Hermione's hand was bolt upright, like a flagpole indicating her choice. "Energy then," Cecilia continued. "Energy in science and magic." She watched as more of them gave each other uncertain looks, and she proceeded quickly. "Right, before we start and I discuss the link, a short question. Ron, Would you kindly give out one sheet of paper to each student, and a pen? He nodded briefly and proceeded to her desk where a pile of lined A4 paper courtesy of her old school sat, with a box of the finest Bic biros that Woolworths could sell her almost a year ago. An opening question, she continued as Ron hurried to dish out the stationery. What is energy? A few hands raised instantly, including Ernie and Hermione. Okay, some of you know. I don't want you to tell me. What I want you to do is talk to the person next to you about your ideas, then we'll hear them. Almost immediately, the students split into pairs, speaking rapidly about the question. It was a technique that they recognized and they fell into the pattern quickly. Cecilia began to circulate amongst them as they spoke, to gauge their answers. Only Harry, 2 rows from the front, did not turn to Ron. He continued to stare at her, following her around the classroom with his eyes. Something to do with power. In food? I remember when we did this. Light is energy. Light bulbs. Exclaimed Padma to her sister, nudging Parvati. Like what Gran used to buy. Cecilia made her way through the tables before stopping to have a conversation with Hermione and Justin. Their discussion seemed particularly in-depth and had something to do with movement and force. It was very good, and Cecilia marveled again at Hermione's ability to recall almost anything she had learned before. Harry, whispered Ron, nudging his friend sharply as Cecilia stepped past them. Come on, mate. Right, okay, called Cecilia to the class. Let's hear some, shall we? She took a variety of responses from the class, noting key ideas on the swivel blackboard she'd pulled out of the Mole Studies office to make room for their research equipment. So, we've got some ideas. Some very good ideas, she added, nodding at her class. Can we hear about the work now, Mrs. Frobisher? Pressed Hermione, her hand raised again. The development, she corrected. Cecilia nodded slowly. Work has been done very recently. She picked up the self-updating Mole textbooks from the desk, that energy and magic are related. Few details are available, but what I am about to share with you. Hermione, she turned to her and smiled. Hermione smiled back. You mentioned that energy was to do with moving things. Would you like to explain? When we move and walk, or cause other things to move, there is energy involved, or we wouldn't be able to do those things. Hermione had got to her feet and was addressing the class matter-of-factly. These are the things we do as a matter of course. Like walking? Cecilia addressed Hermione, nodded. Okay, put your pens flat on the desk. 1 or 2 of the students looked at each other doubtfully, laying the biros down nevertheless. Right. Move the pen. A few frowns now, and many of the students picked up their pens, pushing them across their desks or allowing them to drop on the floor. Good, said Cecilia encouragingly, noticing that Harry had done neither of the things she'd asked. Now, as we know, there's more than one way we could have done that. Or should I say, you. Harry, you didn't take part last time. Could you tell me how else you, as wizards, could have moved the pen? Harry said nothing. He stared back at Cecilia now, his gaze growing more fixed, gripping his wand in his right hand. Anyone? She asked, feeling a slight knot of tension in her stomach. Yes, Ernie? We could use magic. We could use Accio, for example, to move the pen to our hand by magic. He smiled and Cecilia nodded. Okay, all of you, get out your wands, and use energy to make the pens come to you the wizard way. Shrieks of delight accompanied her request for them to use their wands, for it happened so rarely in Mole Studies lessons. Some of the students were on their feet using magic to make their pens hover in midair. Some were beckoning them or making them land on other students' desks. Wingardium Leviosa. Accio. Reparo, said Ron as he trod on his biro that he had knocked on the floor from the last time. Accio. Good, declared Cecilia. Okay, take your seats please. Okay. She looked at the students again. Now, you've all made the pens move with energy, but in two different ways. From the definitions you've given, would you agree with me that we've used energy? There were mutters and low-level chattering from the students. Yes, Neville. Yes, he said uncertainly. We've had to use energy to move it, so by what we've said, the spells contained energy to move it dash. As he spoke, the whispers and low-level noise grew until the students were talking at full volume. But energy. We've not thought of it like that. Is it really energy? Do spells have energy? Mrs. Frobisher, Cecilia heard Hermione call above the rest. Could you tell us some more detail about the energy in spells? Almost at once, the din began to ebb and Cecilia found herself in front of a score of students that were unnervingly silent. Well, there has been some work done into this recently with respect to the genetics of wizards and your ability to convert useful energy from the environment in your cells. She glanced round the classroom at the silent students. Food energy is what everyone can use, even moles, and so in effect magical ability can be determined by studying wizard genetics. Cecilia trailed off, her voice growing uncertain as her eyes became drawn to an ever-rising Harry, who was straightening his knees and getting to his feet. Yes, Harry. Is there something you wish to contribute? There was a pause, a very long one. A feeling as if someone had poured ice-cold water down her back made Cecilia shudder as she watched the young wizard before her. Harry, she tried, watching carefully as he fixed her with a furious glare. What would you like to say? But the last few words of her sentence she mouthed silently, for Harry had flicked his wand. Silencio. Shut up. He reiterated, taking a few more steps towards her. Shut up. I've had it up to here with you wittering on about energy and magic. Like it's all right and like taking a piece of mum is normal. He indicated the top of his head as Cecilia stood before her class in literally mute horrifying terror. She mouthed a few words but still none were heard. Now I'm going to speak, he continued, taking a few more steps towards her. Not much fun being speechless, Mrs. Frobisher. It wasn't a question. Cecilia took a few steps back in blind panic, dimly aware of her students behind him, some standing and moving around, some gasping and muttering. She couldn't speak and Harry was approaching her with his wand aloft. As she bumped into the table, the pile of paper cascading to the floor, she stopped. Harry took another step towards her and Cecilia felt herself shaking. You were out to get me, and my mum. Don't think I don't know. You standing there, all condescending and showy. You have no right. Harry's eyes narrowed and he flicked his wand ever so slightly in the direction of her throat. Expelliarmus. Suddenly Harry's wand shot out of his hand and he turned quickly to find Ron standing behind him. He pushed Harry roughly to one side. Cecilia could see the students bunching round them and she put her hand to her mouth in embarrassment at her inability to speak. Mrs. Frobisher, gasped Hermione walking towards her, holding aloft her wand. Cecilia felt herself pushing her hands forward as a guard between her and Hermione. Audio. She flicked her wand towards Cecilia, who looked in panic at her. You can speak again, Hermione interpreted, glaring mightily at Harry who Ron had pinned against the classroom wall. Swallowing uneasily and pushing her fear down inside her, Cecilia took a step forward. C.Class. Dismissed. She managed, looking past the students and to the door. Dismissed, she repeated. But instead of waiting for them to leave, Cecilia walked round the stunned throng and walked towards it. Behind her action happened. Ron loosed his grip of Harry, who took a step forward and retrieved his wand. He held it aloft as other students approached them, aiming a curse at the door, which missed, before ducking out of Ron's grasp. Deflecto. The vector of the curse was interrupted. It hit the row of books and causing them to explode from the shelf, thumping noisily to the floor. Cecilia threw the door open against the wall and then closed it again, exhaling slowly. She'd had it with running from belligerent wizards with mighty spells. Turning to face her class, who were mostly crowded round Hermione, she addressed Harry, who had been stopped in his tracks again by Ron. "You obviously have some very strong feelings about certain things." Her voice was low and calm. She forced it to be unbroken, and she looked at Harry's hostile expression without emotion. Then she looked at the rest of the class. "Class dismissed," she repeated, stepping forward from the door. Many of the students looked at her and there were low mutters, one or two glancing in her direction. Cecilia nodded in their direction slightly, without taking her full attention from Harry. There were still some students crowded round Harry. Ron was blocking his path bodily. Neville, Seamus and Hermione were standing round Harry, their wands raised in his direction. "Dismissed," she repeated. The students looked between themselves and Seamus took a few steps away from Harry, pulling Neville with him. Neville gave him an indignant look and remained where he was. "If you're sure you can handle the mad bugger, Mrs. Frobisher," Seamus commented on his way to the door, and Cecilia looked between Neville, Ron and Hermione, who were still standing there. Neville lowered his wand, walking past Harry and throwing him a look before he too proceeded through the door, saying nothing. "You too." Her mouth was beginning to dry up as she glanced at Ron and Hermione, registering that Harry still had his wand raised in her direction with a murderous look in his eyes. Both students looked at her without saying anything, and it was clear that they had no intention of going anywhere. "Harry, continue," Cecilia said as calmly as she could, ignoring Ron and Hermione's non-compliance. Barely as the parched, cracked words had left her mouth, Harry had launched into a full tirade. All the pent-up frustrations, annoyances and shame he had been feeling came tumbling out as bitter words. "Sirius was miserable all Christmas after what you did, you and Remus. Taking him off Tunks and shagging him," he began, poking his wand in her direction. "Harry!" exclaimed Ron, shooting his friend a look of shock. "What do you have to say about that, eh?" Cecilia felt her face flush, but she said nothing. "Come on!" he raged furiously. "Answer me." "I'm not arguing with you, Harry," she replied. "Why don't you calm down and we can talk about this sensibly?" But at her words, Harry broke away from Ron's grasp and stormed towards her, wand raised. Cecilia stood motionless, refusing to react. "You can't tell me what to do," he continued, coming within a foot of her. "You think just because you work with Snivellus Snape you can act like him? You think that he keeps you safe? Because believe me, you're wrong." Cecilia felt her stomach slip down more into her legs. She didn't want to move from her spot, for if she did, she imagined it would fall out through her feet. Her brain raced through what she could say, even a rebuke for insulting Snape in absentia, but nothing seemed appropriate. "I'm going to get McGonagall," declared Hermione, dashing past them. Harry gave her no more than a twitch of his head before glaring aggressively at Cecilia again, re-angling his wand in her direction. "Harry," she tried again, the confidence in her voice a mere shadow of what it had been a few moments ago. "Sirius was right. You are just an ignorant mull and you're getting more and more like Snape every day. I'm tired of all this, of you and Snape asking me question after question, making me perform spell after spell. He must really be good in bed for you to stick up for him like you do." He ignored her shocked expression, and the one playing on Ron's features, before continuing. "He's still a Death Eater, you know, and he's going to turn you into Voldemort as soon as the weapon is finished. Did you know that? That's why Draco Malfoy and the rest of them haven't been bothered with you. They've been warned. Harry!" shouted Ron at his friend and marching over to them. His face was bright red and he was clearly angry with Harry. "That's enough. Look, mate, we can see you're upset. "Keep out of this, Ron," Harry snapped. "We all know you fancy her." Ron's face turned almost purple with embarrassment and he sagged visibly. "Yeah? You're right, I did." He glanced at Cecilia, and then back at Harry. "And Mrs. Frobisher's got your best interests at heart, mate. Surely her doing what she's doing's going to stop you-know-who in the long run?" "Cecilia, eh?" he sneered, turning back and facing Ron. "You don't know what it's been like. The questions. You weren't there. In the graveyard. When Cedric. And Cho. She makes me remember them all the time. A stupid mole." Harry stabbed his wand back towards Cecilia. She waited for Harry to make the next move. "Everyone in the Order thinks it's horrible that you want some of my mother. It's no wonder you're not welcome there anymore. Sirius hates you. We all do. I wish you'd just disappear. I wish Sirius had managed to kill you in the summer or at Christmas. Then you wouldn't be here, ruining our lives. Wizards have died because of you to keep you safe, and for what?" His voice trailed off and he glowered. "No." Ron sprang forward to pull Harry's wand from his hand as he raised his wand. Cecilia took a few steps to her left to avoid the full force of the spell which shot past her now as Ron threw himself at Harry and they began to fight. The beam hit the window frame and rebounded back towards Cecilia, skimming past her cheek and set fire to the books that had fallen to the floor by the fireplace from Harry's first spell. Both boys looked up from their fight in response to Cecilia's sharp shrill shriek. A small burn mark shone on her cheek and Cecilia raised a hand to find that some of her hair had been burned away near her ear. Now was the time to run from belligerent wizards. Without saying a word, Cecilia opened the door of the classroom. The class were still crowded in the corridors as she walked slowly and steadily down the corridor towards the courtyard. Towards the courtyard, her mind worked on. Through the doors to the castle. With the great hall in front of her and the steps. "Mrs. Frobisher!" she heard someone shout. Up the steps she would go. "Mrs. Frobisher!" And the next flight. "Hermione's gone to get Professor McGonagall. To the teachers' quarters." Behind her, Harry, who had obviously won his fight with Ron, followed her and began to chase after her, shouting as she passed. One or two of the other classroom doors began to open as students and teachers, disturbed by the noise that had come from the Mole Studies classroom, pressed their faces against windows and opened doors. It had to be done. "Stop!" Harry shouted at her. She had to make it safe for him. Cecilia continued to walk. It was up to her alone. "Miss Bourne." The word reverberated down the corridor. Cecilia stopped in her tracks. "You are Miss Bourne." Without turning to look over her shoulder, Cecilia ran out of the corridor and across the windswept courtyard. 88,888,888. Throwing the door of her room open, Cecilia's mind began to race. She had to get out fast. Out of Hogwarts Castle. Looking about her, Cecilia's eyes caught the desk on which lay some of her personal belongings, jewelry, a pair of socks, hairbrush. She pulled open the second drawer of the desk and searched for her money. Her mole money, which she had put there almost a month ago, throwing handfuls of other things onto the desk as she searched. Once she had it, she thrust it into the bottom of her smaller bag, into which she also threw a pair of jeans, a jumper and a change of underwear. Next she turned to her chemicals, which were under the desk, and seized 3 bottles of solvents, knocking the stack of flasks onto the floor. She stepped over the broken shards which the flasks had become and grabbed her latest notebook and a pen from the desk, thrusting them into the bag too. Got to go, she reminded herself sharply. No time to tidy. Can't take everything. Someone would be here looking for her any minute. Without looking back, Cecilia threw the bag over her shoulder and walked hastily through the door, turning left and throwing the door behind her. "It's in London," she thought desperately as she hurried towards the door to the secret passage next to the staff room at the end of the corridor. North London, near the Green Lane tube line. Cecilia opened the door and hurried down the steps, narrowly missing the ghost of Professor Binns, who passed straight through the door above. Godric's Hollow, London. If she could get to a public library, tomorrow. Catching her breath and quickening her pace, she got to the bottom of the steps and through the dark malodorous passage that led out of the grounds. The mist was beginning to fall as she surveyed the landscape. London. London. How was she to get to London? 2 hours later and the tiny branch line station 5 miles away at Dovetown was beginning to come into view. Darkness was falling fast as Cecilia walked, weary now but still resolute, and her mind raced through strategies and plans for how she would get to London when she was so far away. How glad she was that she had overheard Padma and Parvati Patil mentioning they had got to their mole grandmothers from Dovetown, or she would probably be at Hogsmeade Station wasting her time trying to board the Hogwarts Express. Wind from the cold February weather whipped as the flickering lights illuminated the outline of the building ahead of her, and Cecilia realized that, being probably an unmanned station, it was likely that although it was only 5:30 she had missed any trains that evening that went to any major towns. Underfoot the hard earth changed to gravel, and Cecilia hoisted her bag up her shoulder as she searched the station for where the timetable information would tell her whether she would actually be spending the evening in the station waiting room. She scanned the timetables quickly, looking for towns that she knew would have direct trains to London, and behind her ribs, Cecilia's heart raced as she read through the times. Popewell. Last train 3:45 p.m. Disbrough. 4:40. At a turn Cecilia's hopes were quickly raised and then dashed. Firthorpe. 6:15. But only on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Cecilia's bag fell from her arm as her search became more frantic, her hopes slowly ebbing that she would be able to leave that evening now. "Can I help you, dear?" The voice behind her made Cecilia jump, and she turned suddenly to see a middle-aged woman to her left, leaning out of the door and looking at her curiously. "Only I'm due to be leaving any time now, and there'll be no one here after 6. I need to get to a main town, Middlesbrough, Leeds, Huddersfield. Somewhere like that," she began, trailing off uncertainly, a shrill tone of mild panic entering her voice. "What trains are still to leave tonight?" The woman smiled kindly at Cecilia, beckoning her towards the inside of the station. "Come on in and we'll have a look," replied the woman kindly, smiling at Cecilia as she beckoned her towards the inside of the station. "You look half frozen, young lady. You're not from round here, are you?" she added, in a thick Geordie accent. "Now," she continued, taking Cecilia's silence as a no and pushing her huge, plastic-framed spectacles up her nose, "oh, you've missed the Genthorpe one. That one would have taken you straight to Manchester, and you could have got a train from the .o." She stopped, looking at Cecilia. "Well, you've got a choice. There's one that goes directly to the Newcastle line, which, if you get there this evening, you'll be able to travel to London later this evening. That doesn't leave till after I've gone, at 6:20. Otherwise," she glanced back down, "it's down to Blythe, which'll take you to Durham, and you can catch one from there. That's going to be here in 10 minutes. Cecilia nodded, taking in the information, and the woman folded her arms. Up until the woman left, Cecilia sat and talked with her in a normal conversation. She chatted with Doreen about recent news events which Cecilia had been fortunate to read about in the Mole Studies books that morning, such as the unpopularity of the government and how they would probably be out in that year's election. As Doreen swept the small ticket office, Cecilia told Doreen she was working away from home. And they began to talk. How much petrol was these days and why she hadn't got a car anymore. How Doreen's son had moved to Lancaster with a dreadful girl who was no good for him. About the weather there. and once Doreen had recorded the arrival and subsequent departure of the Blythe train. Would her pension stretch when she retired in 5 years' time, and how she and her husband never thought to save privately, because it wasn't considered necessary 30 years ago. What struck Cecilia as she engaged in the conversation was how calming talking about such mundane, such ordinary things were. The weather of late as Doreen cashed up the till, the fact that stamps had gone up as she switched off the timetable lights with the switches behind the counter, whether she would be all right on her own waiting for the Newcastle train, and when Doreen showed her out of the office at 6 o'clock onto a dark and wintry platform that Cecilia was sure of the location of the nearest phone box in case it didn't come. Cecilia watched Doreen cross the platform and walk down the path that she had walked upon herself to get to the station 3/4 of an hour ago, feeling slightly refreshed at the commonplace conversation she had engaged in. But at the back of her mind a glow of inner determination was still lodged, which began to illuminate as the light of the train bathed the track as it approached. Ticket in hand, Cecilia climbed aboard the train alone, a modern diesel decorated with advertising and information posters. She sat on the bright striped seats in the nearest carriage, which was deserted, slinging bag underneath her chair and settling down as the train got underway. The lights in the carriage dimmed as they moved away from Dovetown station, and Cecilia relaxed into her chair. But could not rest. She had justified her departure in her mind to everyone involved in the research. Except one. Opening her bag quickly, Cecilia looked for some paper so she could write Snape a letter, explaining why she had to go. It would be lame, she knew, and didn't make up for her departure. She could buy some stamps when she got to Newcastle station, it would get there if it was addressed correctly. A pen, she thought, throwing her hand into her bag and breathing a sigh of relief moments later when a blue Bic biro came to hand. Good, Cecilia thought, for she was beginning to think she would have to append her bag and sort through her belongings. Now some paper. She scrabbled around inside the bag again, her hand meeting an elastic band, a hairbrush, her compact. Anything other than paper. Eventually her hand met something papery which she pulled out. It was the book that Severus had given her when he first accompanied her back home, the notebook emblazoned with the Slytherin house insignia. Opening it quickly, Cecilia's mind flicked through what she wanted to say. Severus, she wrote on the second to back page. The decision to leave Hogwarts was not an easy one. I believe in what I am about to do. Please don't try to find me, I have to do this alone. I take sole blame for this, and it should go on record that I alone have done this for our research. I also intend to visit home, and I beg you not to follow me. Do not blame Harry. Do not doubt that I will return, as I have my compact. Cecilia. As the words faded to nothing on the page before her, Cecilia slid the Slytherin notebook and biro back into her bag, leaning her head against the headrest of the seat, and watched the darkness pass by the window.